Jake Broe, friend of the channel. I don't think he's been to Ukraine. I know he's done some fundraisers for Ukraine, some quite successful fundraisers, I might add. But he is an American commentator who talks about the war and examines the war from a distance. So this, in my mind, right, is a step forward in having a pro-Ukraine voice on Piers Morgan. But I would still prefer if they had somebody, and this is nothing to like shake down Jake Broe or whatever, just have it on a Ukrainian. Just have it on a Ukrainian, or at least somebody who's been here and seen the stuff themselves. I think that type of experience would be very useful. This is definitely a huge leap forward, but I would still prefer a Ukrainian, okay? If you can't get that, then go to B, somebody who's been here. If you can't get that, then you can go to C and you can do the litany of online pro-Ukraine commentators. Not knocking Jake Broe, just like fundamentally, there's so many on-the-ground journalists. There's even many, many more Ukrainians that could share their experiences. I just don't know why we all... Maybe it's a subscriber count, but I'm not knocking Jake Broe. I think Jake Broe will probably do quite well. I'm just saying, if I was organizing a show like this, why not just grab from the litany of people who've seen it themselves? I don't know. Whatever. He can always do more in the future. It's not like the war's ending tomorrow. So let's check this out. Apparently Jake Broe is actually on here, not only with, of course, Piers, but two other guys. One of them being Benny Johnson, who was getting paid by Tenet Media, which was that cutout from the Russian government that was getting funneled money from the Russian state. Millions, no, not tens of millions, about $10 million. And Benny Johnson was one of the guys who went out there after getting funneled all this money by the Russian government. He went out there and spread Russian propaganda. He was suggesting that the Moscow mall attack was actually done by the Ukrainians, even though there was no evidence for it outside of the claims of the Russian government trying to point the blame towards Kiev because they can't deal with their terrorism problem, which they've had before. It's not like it just spawned yesterday. I think a lot of people who maybe learned that Russian history is a little deeper than kings and queens and a little bit of communism might have just found that out. But for anybody who's been following Russian politics for quite a while, or you're from Russia, terrorism in Russia is not a new issue. Anyway, let's watch. Oh, and ISIS has a million reasons to hate the Russians. Let's watch this before I get stuck in a why I don't like Benny Johnson rabbit hole.
He's a dictator.
Let me finish.
And nobody likes this war. I don't want this.
America did not overthrow the government. You can look at the crowds.
Oh, shut up, man. With this guy talking about, oh, we just have to help them win. That's what they said for 20 years in Afghanistan. While the Ukrainians are already running out of men, and Jake Sullivan is demanding that they increase conscription. That is slavery.
According to this guy...
I'm sorry. Okay, guys. Great-grandpa on the battlefields of D-Day. You might have not known this. He was a slave. He was a slave the whole time.
Democratic Revolution.
Like, come on, just talk about it like a normal person. Say, like, I don't like conscription because it forces people to fight wars they otherwise wouldn't be. And then you can have a discussion about that, like, okay, but what about the stakes of this war? If there wasn't enough of an army to hold the front line, then what do, you know? Then what happens to these villages behind them? Are those civilians going to be war crimed? Is it a greater good in this instance to call upon people to do this public service? Or is it worse to conscript these people, even if it means that all these people behind them and all these villages are going to be occupied and the damage will be much greater and the death toll possibly much greater? Then you can have that discussion instead of, this is like when the people were in chains. It's like, come on, just whatever. We haven't even started. This is like the trailer. Let's skip the trailer before I fry my own brain. Okay.
In the Oval Office is to dramatically change the rules in a conflict 5,000 miles away. The US has given Ukraine its blessing to fire long-range American missiles into Russia. And
also, I've called them long-range missiles. This is partially my fault, too. I think medium-range missiles would be a better descriptor, okay? Because people don't know the difference between short, medium, and long range. And I'm seeing people on Twitter and on social media saying, oh my God, we just gave Ukraine permission to firebomb Moscow. We didn't give Ukraine permission to firebomb Moscow. The Ukrainians actually could already firebomb Moscow with drones that have been proven to go down 1,500 kilometers deep into Russia's near Siberian regions. I mean, they've gotten pretty deep. They've hit I think their longest recent strike was on a naval base in the Caucasus. I believe in Dagestan. I mean, that's way far away from where the front line is. And that wasn't done with American weapons. That was done with domestically produced Ukrainian drones, which have increased their range from 250 kilometers to 1,500. That is purely domestic Ukrainian engineering. The difference now is that these missiles are harder to intercept and they've got a bigger payload, but they can only go 300 kilometers, which means none of them can reach Moscow. None of them can reach the decision-making in the Kremlin. They can reach a bunch of, like, some air bases, some ammunition depots, some troop storages, where troops are gathering to assault Ukrainian positions in Kursk. It'll mostly be helpful for, the Kursk area. So I think when we say long range, some people get the idea of, my God, now nowhere in Russia is safe. Of course the Russians are going to know. There's plenty of places in Russia that are not in range of these things.
It's already done so. The UK has now done the same. Now Vladimir Putin is changing the rules too. The Kremlin says it will consider an attack from a non-nuclear state, if backed by a nuclear power, as a joint assault on Russia. This wouldn't be Putin's first.
Are you okay, bro? 1,000 kilometers? What drugs are you on? Is this like a genuine confrontation? Brother, be serious. 1K kilometers. Okay, if you don't believe me, I will stop stream for 5 seconds to prove to you that Ukrainians actually kind of know what they're doing, and they can engineer some pretty damn good drones. I mean, I've seen the drones, so maybe I'm just deluded too. Okay. Ukrainian drone attack on Dagestan. Now, we all agree that Dagestan is 1,000 kilometers, more than 1,000 kilometers away from the front line, yes? Do we all agree that the Caspian Sea is not the Azov Sea? Okay, here you go. ISW analyzes Ukrainian drone strike on Russian ships in Caspian Sea. Caspian Sea is more than 1,000 kilometers away. There's a picture of an explosion. The Russians reported it themselves. Either the Russian and the Ukrainians are lying and they just blew up their naval forces for no reason, or the Ukrainian forces have been able to design some pretty far-traveling drones in over 3 years of war. Yeah, I know the idea of them going from 250 kilometers to over 1,500 kilometers in some instances is crazy to think about. It's like, whoa, that's a huge jump. But yeah, it's because they're in a struggle for survival and their engineers are working near 24/7 to try to find whatever improvements they can. Anyway, back to the video.
First empty nuclear threat. Far from it. But many people are furious at what they see as a reckless gamble, taken so close to the inauguration of a new president with new plans. And President Trump's plans could be very different indeed.
Dylan, don't pull my. I don't even know what you're saying. You have no start location, and choose anywhere in Ukraine you want. You choose Odessa, choose Kramatorsk, choose. You can choose some areas in Kursk even. Every single point of it is going to be less than 1,000 more than 1,000 kilometers away.
The only thing Russia can spread right now is suffering, oligarchy, and autoimmune deficiency. This is Rusky Mir.
Thank you so much for the $5. Unless the question is, okay, they took these really big drones and they got like 30 of them. They snuck them 50 to 500 kilometers into Russia, found an area, clearing, that they would be able to clear enough trees and enough area to launch them from the ground without getting caught, and then snuck another 500 kilometers back into Ukraine. Like, they launched them from Ukraine. They launched from Ukraine. Many journalists have gone to the places, well, not many, but a few journalists have gone to the places where they launched them from. They launched them from Ukraine. You're yapping hard now? Okay, you're just mentally deficient. That's fine. We do have a shorter, there's like a short bus. We have a short stream. You can hang out here for a little bit, take in maybe 20 minutes of information, tap out, leave for 30 minutes, give your brain a rest, go watch like Skibbity Toilet, whatever the fuck you wanna, then you can come back later in like another 30 minutes and you can continue.
Campaigned on ending this war without saying how he would do that. Many of his supporters believe that MAGA means American money for Americans first. But where will that leave the Ukrainians fighting for their independence and their freedom? How worried should we be about the prospect of nuclear catastrophe? And if Trump supporters believe in peace through the projection of power, will they back him if he follows through in using it? To debate this, I'm joined by the host of The Benny Show, Benny Johnson, United States Air Force veteran and YouTube commentator, Jake Broe, author of new book Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and in the Catastrophe in Ukraine, Scott Horton, and the former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs, General Mark Kimmitt. Well, welcome to all of you. General Kimmitt, let me start with you as the senior military man in the room. I've taken a position from the start of this, and my brother was a British Army colonel, my brother-in-law was a British Army colonel, lots of military in my family. And it's interesting because they've completely disagreed about this from the start. I've taken a view of being very pro-Ukraine's right to defend itself against what I viewed as an illegal invasion of a sovereign democratic European country. And that everything that's followed since is in that context. But it's interesting because my brother, for example, would say it's not a war that Ukraine can win, that Russia, with its superior power, was never going to lose this war. Yep. What do you feel, from a military perspective first, what do you feel about where this war now is? And do you agree that it's something that Ukraine can't win?
Well, I'll let him talk for a bit before I chime in with my piece, my usual spiel.
Well, listen, Piers, first of all, I think it's important to understand that two things can be right at the same time. It is certainly the case that a sovereign nation has the right and the ability to defend itself if attacked. But I've written a number of pieces for Wall Street Journal. 3 months after the war started, I said this is going to turn out to be a stalemate. So in many ways, I think it's inevitable that our policy, the United States policy, was give them just enough to fight but not enough to win, is exactly what got us into this position right now. Despite what's happened in the last week with President Biden and his team dumping more equipment in there, I don't think this is a winnable war. If you define winning by President Zelensky's old standard, which is retake and restore territorial integrity, take back Crimea, and make Russia pay for this war. If that's the definition of victory, there's not a chance that Zelensky can win this war.
And before I go to the others, this argument, which I know some of them will put forward, that basically Ukraine brought this on themselves and that it was the encroachment, as Russia saw it, the encroachment of NATO, which was then going to include Ukraine, and that they had no choice but to defend themselves against this NATO encroachment. What do you say to that argument?
Okay, well, before we move on to that, it is true that I think the drip, drip, drip aid approach certainly contributed to this position we are in now. I also think that there's certain decisions that, if made earlier, probably could have changed the position we're in now as well, on top of the amount of aid. Not only, of course, giving more shells, which that's also a question of supply, not completely a question of political will, but we had more in storage. You can have a temporary reduction in military readiness in order to deal with a immediate military threat in Europe. In my mind, I believe the Euro-Atlantic relationship is important enough for that. But I think there's also a question of decisions about, for example, the MiG fighter jets that could have been sent over by Poland at the start. And then the approvals for sending over F-16s and getting the Ukrainians prepared on them. If we made those decisions early in 2022, then maybe they could have had those jets in the sky for mid-2023 or late 2023. The Ukrainian pilots learned on them very quickly, and the Ukrainians already have them in the sky. So if we did that decision-making earlier, maybe they could have had them in the sky earlier. If we got them the long-range missiles earlier for the 2023 counteroffensive, and maybe said it doesn't have to be in this area, maybe it could be
Burns is a
morally corrupt, bankrupt man into Russia itself, like Bryansk, or areas on the border where if Russia lost territory, that would be probably very humiliating for them, just like Kursk was. And then it would be a question of trading land for land instead of trying to attack Russia where they're strongest along the Surovikin line. And if they were supported by long-range strikes, that could have disrupted Russian logistics. But the thing is, right, looking back, all you're doing is looking back. You're saying, oh, if we change this and change this, and in hindsight, like, it's all just a game and trying to, well, if the generals knew this and the generals knew that, you know? But a lot of this was political restrictions and supply restrictions. Of course, there were some strategic, decisions that were made. I think, for example, while the Battle of Bakhmut did become kind of legendary, many people have criticized the decision to stay there and the loss of manpower for Ukrainian forces. I do not believe that criticism is hollow. And I mean, Bakhmut was probably the biggest example, but there might be other smaller examples of that in other locations, even if the Russian casualties have still been, under basically any respectable estimation, much higher than Ukrainian casualties. Okay, so we're talking about the past. Now we're talking about now. I believe that no matter what, whether or not there is still some narrow pathway that can be walked to actually push the Russians out of Crimea and get every single demand militarily, which I think is, at this point, highly unlikely. There are other pathways to getting back your land. There are other pathways to winning wars or achieving the majority of your nation's objectives outside of complete military domination. The Chechens were able to get their version of victory after the Russians invaded them the first time, even though they didn't win every battle, and if it was a complete slugfest 1-for-1 between Russian soldiers and Chechens, the Russians would have won. And they did come back around later and invade them and then prove that fact. But if you, for example, trade Kursk for getting Zaporizhia and Kherson back, or at least the territories that are occupied across the river, these are things that would be much closer to Ukrainian demands and Ukrainian territorial claims than would be if we don't give them the supply, than it would be if we don't give them the supplies and tools necessary to strain the Russians, hurt the Russians, and make it so they can no longer perpetuate this war into the future. I mean, it works one of two ways. It either is going to work where one of the nation states under too much pain eventually says, you know, I can't take too much, or, while they're compelled into a negotiation, or it's getting to a breaking point, or one of the sides just straight up breaks. Where there's a break in the front line, the situation changes very quickly, very radically. It's going to be slow, and then not slow at all. And under those circumstances, who knows what can happen? Anything could happen. So I think that obviously that doomsday outcome on Ukraine's side, the idea of the front line breaking, is a terrible, terrible, terrible outcome. I think that the outcome of, just being able to hold on to what they have now and not using the Kursk land that they fought for to trade back for territory would still be a bad outcome. Maybe not the worst outcome, but would still be a bad outcome. And anything past that would be an ever-increasing better and better outcome. The goal should not be, in my mind, just to look at this as, oh, Ukrainian victory, or achieving something of value in this war, is only if the Ukrainians, using the means that we've given them up to this point, are able to push the Russians completely out of Crimea. If not, then the idea of supporting Ukraine has been a failure. This is a huge mistake. Because this is all negotiated or talked about in the realm of, oh, the Russians were completely reasonable the whole time, and at any point we could have shaken their hand and said, okay, let's call it quits, just leave it where it is. Which I don't believe. I don't believe that to be the case. The Russians are still demanding the rest of Kherson and Zaporizhia. They're still demanding the rest of Kherson and Zaporizhia. They're still demanding that right now. I was just in Kherson. They're hunting civilians in Kherson. It's called a human safari for a reason. It's not media spectacle. It's not performance. It's not hyperbolic. That's what's happening in Kherson. I've interviewed the victims. I've interviewed the ambulance crews who were bombed trying to get to the victims. There's plenty of footage provided by the Russians themselves online. If you give them that city, it will be a massacre. I have no interest in making that concession or trying to push Ukraine to make that concession. And every single time I think about what's going on there, I just think about what happened in Mariupol. I think about what happened in these other cities. And it leaves me very, I would say, not plussed about the idea of Russia taking more land as it continues to push and ask for more, demand more. And if we accept it where it is, say this was all a failure, and pull out, which is what some people are suggesting, including those on this very panel, you're not going to be decreasing the bloodshed, you're going to be increasing the bloodshed. Stopping an advancing army that invaded your country from taking more land is a victory of some sort. It might not be the ultimate victory you wanted, but it should be the bare minimum of what we are aiming to achieve. Not the end of what we should be aiming to achieve, But up to this point, the Russians have not been conciliatory to a point where they're accepting Ukraine as a sovereign nation state, able to govern itself, rule itself, and make its own decisions. And until it talks to it like a normal nation and negotiates an agreement that has the Russians not invading them again, then it makes no sense to stop supporting Ukraine. And in fact, I would say, if you want to bring the war to a quicker end, you would want to increase support for Ukraine to make it clear to the Russians that they can't just wait us out, because that's the current strategy. That's why they're waiting for the next administration to be sworn in. So no matter what pathway I'm going towards, whether it's maybe there is a chance that the Russian line breaks after like a huge crash in morale, the Russian economy goes under, and the Russian economy has been facing some problems recently, or there's another march on Moscow, because who could have predicted the Prigozhin coup? But you can't hold out for these things. You can't hold out for these things. And if you can't achieve that, then you want to put the Ukrainians in the best position to make the Russians realize they are not getting a colony back, and they're going to have to negotiate with them and make a deal with them that they can live with, because Ukraine is a sovereign nation state, and they have to deal with that fact for the rest of their lives. So one of these outcomes is better than the other, obviously, if you're Ukrainian, and I sympathize with that immensely. But these, in my mind, are the only two semi-acceptable outcomes.
Well, what I'd say is that's been the great debate over NATO enlargement since 1991. At that time, when Secretary James Baker agreed with Genscher that there would not be any eastward expansion. We must understand that Russia has as much paranoia about foreign forces creeping up to their borders as the United States does.
By the way, even if the story about, and Gorbachev himself has disputed the no more NATO bases eastward, etc., that has been semi-disputed by Gorbachev himself. Even if this was true, this was said by a Secretary of State to a foreign politician when the Secretary of State did not have the authority to make those decisions or make those concessions before the Soviet Union had even collapsed, which is one thing that confuses me about it in the first place. It's not written down anywhere. There's no formal agreement on any paper. And then after the Soviet Union had collapsed, what did the Russians do? They invaded Moldova. They then invaded Chechnya. It's like they were trying to compel people to go join the military alliance that is an island of stability, well, not an island, a continent of stability in Europe, instead of descending into the chaos of either land being reclaimed by an empire back on the march, or the chaos of the Balkans, which is kind of self-explanatory.
The only difference is that we've had that doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine, since 1807, that we will not allow another country to encroach into our hemisphere. So I think it's reasonable concern that the Russians had that NATO would put military forces in Ukraine, and that unfortunately gave a lot of heartburn and heartache and stomachache to Russia. Don't think they needed to attack, but it's unfortunate that they did.
I will also point out the fact that when they invaded in 2014, it was not over NATO, it was over an EU accession agreement that the pro-Russian president of Ukraine negotiated. So I don't really think it was just, oh, you're not allowed to be in NATO. I think, and people can disagree with me if they want to, I think Russia wanted control of Ukraine's economy. They wanted control of what they saw as their sphere of influence. And so if Ukraine was to even tilt towards the West or try to play the West and the East off of each other, which is a little bit of what Yanukovych was kind of maybe a little bit trying to do with the association agreement, no, you're not allowed to do that. You have to serve Russia's interests. And once you start treating the people like that, what are you doing but pushing them away?
Benny Johnson, welcome back to Uncensored. Always great to have you. You and I don't agree about this, but explain to me, I mean, your position, I'm going to miscategorize it, but I think your position is the kind of making America great theme means that America should put itself and its own interests first, and those interests do not include racing to the defense of a country thousands of miles away that's already had a lot of billions of American money poured into it and can't...
Well, 26 billion in American money. The rest has been equipment. Was it even 26? Might have been 22.
Defeat the enemy anyway. Is that broadly where you sit?
Yes. And if you go talk to the progressive left, or if you go talk to anyone at a MAGA rally, they'll tell you the exact same thing.
I canvass for Bernie. Don't speak for me. Fuck you.
This is one of the most unifying issues in America right now, is that Americans are done having our greatest treasure, which is the lives of Americans, poured into countries that are not our own, defending terror.
You're right. I really hated the Battle of Bakhmut, that moment when the Marine Corps got encircled and they all went, ooh, we die together. What the fuck is he talking about? We haven't lost a single American soldier in Ukraine. You can't make, I'm sorry, this is the problem. They all copy and paste their arguments from one war to another war. And so for them, it's all the same. Afghanistan's the same as Ukraine. Iraq's the same as Ukraine. The Gulf War is the same as Ukraine. Vietnam's the same as Ukraine. It's all the same, even though we're not losing any American troops. And there's a population there that wants us there. This is already two big separating factors from, say, a lot of Vietnam and what's happening in Ukraine. There's a bunch of different factors. You can't just copy and paste these arguments. And that's what he's doing. Oh, we don't need American soldiers dying around the world. He's not dying. They're not dying in Ukraine. They're not dying. No American soldiers have died.
Territories and borders.
The only American soldiers that have died have been the volunteers who have gone to Ukraine to fight with them because they believed in their struggle.
That are not our own. And then other treasures of Americans, like our national debt, our actual monies being spent to the tune of $35 trillion in debt. What is that going to leave our children? It certainly hasn't made the world a safer place, Piers. And I'll say this, it is.
By the way, when people say that, it's true that not every dime we have spent has made the world a safer place. But Europe is much safer than what it used to be. It is one of the most economically, and when it comes to civil society, developed and well-off places in the world that we do a lot of trade with, and we've made a pretty strong defensive alliance with. To say that it's made nobody safer, what we did in World War II or what we did following, expanding this alliance after the Cold War, for the nations who are in that alliance, it absolutely has made them safer. You cannot say that about Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. You cannot say that the trade with Europe has not benefited us. You cannot say that our shared prosperity is something to revel in. It's not to say that every dime we've ever spent fighting in whatever dirt hole in the world we have isn't was 100% worth it or has made the world safer. But discrediting the entirety of the Euro-Atlantic relationship's value because of Afghanistan, Iraq, or Vietnam, I think is really reductive and simple-minded.
Suicidal for Joe Biden on his way out to sabotage a peace that President Trump has promised to bring to this region, and I hope he does, because an ugly peace is better than a hot war. For Joe Biden to say that...
This is also stupid. Okay, there's two things here that are stupid. The first thing here is stupid is he sabotaged peace by saying that the Ukrainians can fire back at the Russians. No, he's just acknowledged that there's a war. And I don't care what reality you live in, we live in this reality. And right here in Kyiv, we hear the missiles, we hear the drones, we hear all of it hitting at the cities. There's been power outages, intermittently again, because the Russians are trying to knock out the electricity during the worst parts of winter. That's the way that they do war. You go to Kherson, they're hunting humans. That's the way that they do war. There's a war here. You might not like it, I might not like it, the world might not like it. There's a war here. Trying to pretend there's not a war here by putting pillows on your fists is not, it doesn't help anyone. It's not helped anyone, and this hasn't destroyed peace or anything like that. If the strategic reality of the war did not change overnight because of this decision, it might help the Ukrainians in Kursk. It probably pissed the Russians off a little bit. It did not destroy the ability for peace. The things that will propel the Russians to peace is not the good nature and loving values of Vladimir Putin. It will be the strategic reality on the ground and the pressure put upon them, making them come to some realization that there is no path forward. They have to find something else. That's the way you would gain peace, not by either conceding endlessly or by what? Just like playing with your hands tied behind your back? Like you fight, just if you fight worse, then peace shall come? No, it doesn't make any sense. As for the other thing, what was the other thing he said?
Suicidal for Joe Biden on his way out to sabotage a peace that President Trump has promised to bring to this region, and I hope he does, because an ugly peace is better than a hot war.
It's very easy for somebody to sell somebody else's freedom, but not your own. Not your own. I don't know what else to say about this.
For Joe Biden to say that American missiles should be lobbed into the heart of Russia. Would you stand for it if Russian missiles were being lobbed into the Midwest?
If we had invaded Mexico, said Mexicans weren't real, and started hunting Mexicans and trying to occupy their country, no, you know what? I probably wouldn't. I probably wouldn't care all that much. I'd probably care on a humanitarian level for the people who would be affected, but my common sense would compel me to say our nation deserved it.
I certainly wouldn't.
Well, Russian missiles, Russian missiles are being lobbed indiscriminately into a European sovereign democratic country. They've also just recruited 10,000 North Korean soldiers to join the war. And I'm just curious, Benny, genuinely curious. I hear you, and I respect your opinion. Genuinely curious, if you went back 25, 30 years, the idea that Republicans would be happy for a Russian dictator helped by North Korea to invade a sovereign democratic European country and actually want Putin to keep what he's stolen would be unthinkable. I mean, I think...
Okay, no, I don't want to steal the land. I just like to take their propaganda, regurgitated verbatim, and get paid by them. I don't want them to win. I just get paid by them. And then say, maybe the Ukrainians are ISIS. Come on.
MAGA is so cowardly. They are actually cowards. Not me. Not us. Iron within. Iron without. We are actual Giga Chads.
Thanks for $5. Iron in, iron without.
Well, hang on. Not allow
I think very well. Okay, you can answer, but I'll add this to
you, man. But I'm not going to allow you to categorize.
Well, let me add this to it.
Allow you to categorize it that way. Nobody's happy about this.
I will, but
Vladimir Putin's an
hang on. Let me finish.
By the way, there is like a sadistic kind of joy I see on parts of the right when bad things happen to Ukraine, and I'm not joking. It's clear. I see it with both of my eyes. When Zelensky's like, we need money to fight, we need money to struggle. People in the replies like, Lamau, get bombed. You gotta end the war. You gotta sell off your land. You gotta let your people be occupied. They're down there. They're like having a low-key party. Not all of them, obviously. But let's not pretend that there isn't like a type of sadistic joy that is in a lot of these comment sections that are in some of these crowds. I mean, you go to certain MAGA crowds. I mean, people have gone there and interviewed people. It's like, no, I'm for Putin. And I mean, you know, you describe Putin as a strong guy. You have Marjorie Taylor Greene saying the Russians are a Christian army. You know, you got Tucker Carlson going to Russia and making like old style propaganda about it. What did you think the effect was going to be?
He's a dictator.
Let me finish.
And nobody likes this war. I don't want this war to happen.
But let me finish.
I don't want this war to be won by. I don't want this war to be happening at all. I want there to be peace. I want people to stop dying.
Yeah.
If let me just be clear. If China occupied Texas to California, would he just be like, you know, if we have to sell out all of the Midwest as well and disarm and do that, like, there would be a limit. There would be a limit because it's not just about peace. It's about justice. It's about a foundation that builds for peace going forward. And if we just find an immediate ceasefire and don't build the conditions for Ukraine to be able to live with some level of prosperity and stop another invasion, then all you've done is pat yourself on the back, you know, called yourself a good boy, and signed the death warrants of another generation of Ukrainian men just 5 to 10 years from now.
Much like Israel and Gaza, I want peace. I do not want this to drag on so that it creates a nuclear conflict that might draft my children or your children into another war. You have military-age sons, Piers. Would you want them to fight in Ukraine?
But the point...
Biden committed to never sending an American soldier to Ukraine. There's no way Trump's going to do it. I just, like, there is a war going on. We have dealt with these types of nuclear confrontations between powers before, during the Berlin crisis, during the Vietnam War, during Korea, during many other wars. This is another war. We do not all of a sudden get reminded of the fact that atomic weapons exist, start shaking in our boots, piss our pants, and then run away. We have to act like grown men. You got to tug on your nuts a bit, and you have to deal with the fact that this is the war as it is. It's, you know, both sides have atomic weapons, but the Russians have the same disincentives, if not even more, to not expand the war. If they're having problems fighting the Ukrainians, how are they going to fight platoon after platoon of U.S. Marines backed up by the German Bundeswehr, backed up by the French Foreign Legion, backed up by the British Special Services, backed up by... NATO is an alliance of 1 billion lives. Russia is a country of 160 million people. Let's keep some realism about us. Of course, atomic weapons are destructive. We should avoid an escalation that would lead to that. But this did not lead to that. It is firing back at an army that is firing at you. It's called war.
The point I was going to make before you interrupted me was...
But would you? Would you like for your sons? You have military-age sons. You want them to go fight in Ukraine.
I will answer that question in a moment. But what I will say to you first of all is what I was trying to say before you jumped in, which was, what is the difference, just ideologically, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait? Kuwait wasn't a NATO country. Why did Desert Storm happen? Why did General Norman Schwarzkopf, encouraged by every Republican I've ever met in my life, encourage the removal of Saddam Hussein from Kuwait? What is the difference? You were basically supporting Kuwait's right to defend itself and to have freedom from a rampaging dictator from Iraq. Why the different rules now? What changed?
There's so much that's changed, especially in the policy of the Republican Party, which is where I thought you were going with this, Piers, which is why I cracked a smile, because the Republican Party itself has now taken a stance against neocons. I would argue probably the worst decision Kamala Harris made on the campaign trail, and that's a long list. Piers, I wonder if you'd agree with me on this, is to bring Liz Cheney on the trail with her.
Totally agree.
And to say, Liz Cheney is going to be my Secretary of Defense.
Totally agree.
You go and say that to Arab communities.
She did not say that at any point.
MAGA is 420% freaking heresy.
Why couldn't he just be like hanging out with Liz Cheney? Why did he have to like lie at the end of it? Liz Cheney is going to be Harris's Secretary of Defense. She wouldn't even. Why would she even be the Secretary of Defense? He'd probably pick another general. Probably pick some 4-star general like Biden did.
Communities in Michigan, and you wonder why you lose Michigan.
Yeah.
I think it's suicidal. I think people are done with neocon ideology.
Yeah.
And to your point about Saddam Hussein, I'll say the same thing that I'll say about Putin. I'll say the exact same thing. These are dictators. They're bloodthirsty. I don't think they're to be trusted. I don't like these actions. But let me tell you,
They're not to be trusted. So that's why we should get a peace as soon as possible, even if it's bad and causes another war. Like, it's one thing if he said, we need a peace to end the violence, or something that will truly end the violence and make sure. No, he just said a bad peace. A bad peace means another war in 5 years. It's all virtue signal. There's no value here about actually ending the bloodshed. It's all about short-term political gain. Being able to have Trump come out and say, look at me, I'm the peacemaker. And it'll be just like Obama, like 10 years after, where everybody's going to resent him here because they're going to be like, oh yeah, the guy who sold us out. Like, you have to make a decent enough peace for peace to be possible.
American first. I was born on this soil. This is my country. I am a Native American. I'm born here. My grandparents were born here.
Huh. I never knew that about it. What tribe?
I do not want my children, and I have 4, Piers, to die for Iraq. I don't want my children to die for Afghanistan or die fighting ISIS or Russia in Ukrainian soil. I think that is...
Wait, he doesn't think we should have fought ISIS? That was like Trump's crowning, like, is the thing he complains about. I mean, like, brags about all the time. It's like, hey, we killed ISIS. We killed ISIS. Hey, we killed ISIS. Hey. But you know what we had to do to kill ISIS? We had to help allies mostly on the ground to do the fighting. So we didn't have a lot of Americans die fighting ISIS. There were still some that died fighting ISIS, but not a lot. And the reason why is because we supported the Kurds. The same Kurds that Trump went back and, you know, backstabbed a bit.
Antithetical to the founding of this nation and antithetical to our...
We fought the Barbary pirates in like 1810 or something. Like, what does he mean, the antithetical? The founding fathers that they all worship, okay? And I think they've done some good things too. I have some compliments for, you know, freedom of speech or whatever. They wanted to fight the Barbary pirates. And like even the founding fathers, who they cite as like really like isolationist types, who's like, oh, don't get entangled in foreign conflicts. Most of it was in commentary about we can't get entangled in foreign conflicts right now because America's too weak, we're a burgeoning nation, and we don't want to get thrown. There were some that didn't want it at all, but a lot of times when they have this blanket, like the founding fathers would never, number one, the founding fathers lived like 400 years ago. The idea that a housing crisis in the United States can cause a worldwide recession would be completely foreign to them. And so our interconnectedness is higher than ever before. Something they couldn't have been, like a different age is like a different country. But also, they weren't even all isolationists. Again, the Barbary pirates that they all went over to the Middle East to fight.
Our great founding father, George Washington, who warned in his last declaration to the American people as he was leaving office, do not get embroiled in foreign entanglements.
See, this is the exact quote I was talking about that's always used.
It's the destroyer of nations.
Okay,
and we've seen it with the British Empire.
Benny?
Piers, sorry to. We've seen it with the British Empire. We've seen it with every empire that has existed, with the Roman Empire, all the way through. And I think we should follow these wise words. And
one final point to you before I go to the others, which is, if a deal was done and Putin got to keep the land he's stolen, along with Crimea, and his next action is to go and invade Poland, just as Nazi Germany did in 1939, what should America do in that position, given that Poland is part of NATO?
Again, that would be suicidal for Russia because Poland is part of.
Ooh, it's painful. Look, because on one hand, he doesn't want to seem weak and say, well, do nothing. But the philosophy he just laid out would be, well, do nothing. And they don't want to answer this question because it's like, well, this is not hypothetical that it ever happened because Russia will never invade a NATO country. Okay, and what if they do? If you degrade NATO's Article 5, by saying, like, I won't defend you if you don't pay the 2 to 3%, you make it seem like it's much more transactional than a security priority of the United States. It tests the foundations of the only important part of NATO. Everything else is cool, I guess. The anti-terrorism stuff can be cool every once in a while, whatever. But the most important underlying part of NATO is Article 5, and you wear that down. I'm not saying it happens. I'm just saying I don't think you're making it less likely.
NATO, and then they would.
But what should America do?
Well, Article 5 would be enacted. This is a NATO article.
Ooh, he doesn't want to answer it because he knows the foundation he laid out would be abandon them too, but he doesn't want to say abandon them to the British host.
Morally, what do you think morally America should do in that eventuality?
Burns is an immoral.
I will have to leave it. I'll have to leave it up to the military minds.
Cowardly. Manic State, thank you for the primer. Just say it's not our business. Just say it. Just say it. Just say it. Just say that you want to pull an old style abandoned Poland. I mean, look, think about it this way. Think about it as continuing the Western tradition of abandoning Poland. Maybe if you say it that way, you'll feel better about it.
Some of them are on this panel. I'll say this, and this is my stance permanently, Piers, which is that an ugly peace in the Ukrainian war, an ugly peace, and virtually.
No, it seems like any peace. If you see, the foundation of what he's laying for is an ugly peace everywhere. Give up a bit of Ukraine, give up a bit of Poland, give up a bit of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, everything. Why not? Just give up a bit of all of it, because an ugly peace is better than a war. The war, tug on your nuts. My God, how could you like espouse like, oh, the founding fathers this, oh, I love American freedom that, oh, you might have to bleed for it? No, I don't believe in that. God, man. I will tell the foreigner when they've done enough bleeding for their freedom.
In all situations, an ugly peace is better than a hot war.
Okay, maybe my stance. I mean, I find it strange that you wouldn't say, obviously, you got to kick him out of Poland. Let me go to Jake Broe, U.S.
Well, that's what Article 5 would be. Article 5 would be an attack.
No, he's not asking you about the policy implementation of what the alliance would do. We're asking your opinion, Benny. Give an opinion. Oh no, he's found a new Russian money sink. He wants that money source back. He needs it back. He's been on the Russian money so long he doesn't know how to get off of it. He needs to like get like a tobacco patch or something. I don't know, like an RT patch, something to help him with the withdrawals.
What would happen? I know what's supposed to happen. I was curious what your moral view of it is, given what you said earlier. Jake Broe, US Air Force veteran, thank you for your service. Obviously, I know you don't agree here. I am genuinely, it is very surprising how the politics of this kind of thing have changed so dramatically. It would have been unthinkable 30 years ago to have a conversation with conservatives on the airways.
Jake is the only person on here who's like really pro-Ukraine, like really wants to continue supporting Ukraine, continue supporting the aid. I think the person on the far right here, as the guy in the suit on the right, he might be, but I don't know enough about him. So he's the only confirmed NATO Ukrainian agent on the panel today. So he's got a lot of work ahead of him.
Where they would talk this way, I think, about this. I'm not saying, by the way, that Benny's wrong, and I'm not saying he's not right, that a lot of Americans agree with him. But how do you feel about it?
The conservatives really had their act together in the George W. Bush years, right, everybody?
Right. Yeah, I mean, what's your view of this?
They were really great back then.
So, Piers, I'm going to defer to your former UK Prime Minister, who stated this week that there's this segment of the Republican Party that has a weird homoerotic fixation on Putin. They love his tough guy image. They love his tough guy politics.
Okay,
it doesn't appeal to me.
He's not going for the reconciliation approach of, come on, guys, let's reach our roots again. No, he's like, nah, you guys are gay. Okay, let's see how this goes. Yeah, it's funny.
But it does appeal to a certain segment of the Republican Party. And to bring up the neocons and what happened 20, 25 years ago, I didn't support the Iraq War. I was 19 in 2003. And I'm firmly in support of this war, supporting Ukraine, because this is a generational fight. History is...
By the way, when we say support this war, we need to think of like a new way to say this, because war isn't like something you like support or don't support if it's forced upon you, okay? It's like if somebody mugs me and I'm like, okay, better take out my pistol and defend myself. Like, it's like, oh, do you support this this mugging? Do you support? No, you wouldn't say do you support this mugging. The mugging was forced upon you. You're defending yourself. Do you support action in this? Yeah, I support defending myself. I support Ukraine defending itself. We need to think of a new way to phrase this.
Corrupt, bankrupt man.
Hey, RDK, thank you for the primer.
It's repeating itself. All the claims that Putin is making about Russian speakers in the Donbass region and past territorial claims, it's the exact same argument that Hitler made in World War II, going into the Rhineland and then Czechoslovakia and, of course, Poland. And the other panel member talking about America First, we had an America First movement in 1938, 1939, 1940 to keep the United States out of World War II. I don't want to go to war. I don't like...
By the way, funny enough, it's literally called the America First movement. Like, it was, if you look up America First, World War II, it'll tell you all about it. It was American isolationism saying, you know, what did Hitler do to us? Not our problem. Why fight with Hitler? Hitler wants peace. Why fight Hitler?
To keep the United States out of World War II. I don't want to go to war. I don't like war. But sometimes democratic nations aren't given a choice. What is happening today has never happened since the advent of nuclear weapons. A nuclear-powered state has said, this territory used to belong to us, we want it back, give it to us because we have nuclear weapons. This is not something the Western Alliance or the international community can tolerate. Nuclear states talking about historical claims, saying, give us back territory that once belonged to us, otherwise we're going to nuke you. Day 2 of this full-scale invasion, and we just went over 1,000 days. Day 2, Putin raised the equivalent of his DEFCON, saying, don't help Kyiv. Don't give any assistance, otherwise we might use nukes. And for 1,000 days, they haven't used nukes because they can't. I can lay out the arguments why, but this is not tolerable because it'll never end. If this works, it will embolden dictators around the world, the first group who already have nukes, to start talking about historical claims because they know the international community is not going to stop them, and any dictators that want to go and get back historical territory, they're going to want nukes. And for any smaller country who doesn't feel defended by the international community, they're also going to want nukes now, because the United States, France, UK, the democratic countries that have nuclear weapons are not going to help them. Okay. They're not going to defend them.
Okay.
By the way, Ukrainians have been talking about renuclearization. It's an open topic. I think that like 6-month timetable in in the, was it the Telegraph, I believe. I think that's probably not true, but I mean, Ukraine has a lot of old Soviet scientists. I mean, or at least enough. I think they could probably, with enough time and effort, if they could divert the resources, go for it. And at this point, they agreed that they'd give up their atomic weapons if their territorial sovereignty was respected. Obviously, that agreement has not been upheld on one side of the bargain. Why should it be upheld on the other side of the bargain? When people talk about like the threat of atomic war, I understand the immediate risk and what people fear around that. But we also need to think about the long-term consequences of the normalization of this type of behavior, especially when the narrative is Ukraine gave up its nukes in respect for its territorial sovereignty, got invaded, got conquered. What's the lesson there? What's the lesson? Especially when we were the ones convincing them to give them up. We even had congresspeople on the House floor saying starve them out, deny food aid when these post-Soviet countries, I'm saying post-Soviet only to indicate that it was in the immediate post-Soviet period, were in economic destruction. I think Ukraine had an inflation rate of 10,000%. There were street kids. There was a street kid epidemic of homeless children. People were starving. And in this moment, that was the moment people were talking about, maybe we should starve them out to give up their nukes. It never got to that point. But the fact that was being talked about on the House floor gives you the idea of like, yeah, we have a right to like write the rules. And the memorandum that was respecting their territory was supposed to be their guarantee after they made this sacrifice for the international community. Because the Americans were saying the Russians will invade you if you don't give them up. They're like, fine, we give them up. Then they get invaded. So when we talk about the long-term standards and the narratives that people will learn from this, what people will take from this, I think that could degrade atomic security down the line unless we do right by Ukraine, in my mind.
We go to Scott, because you've literally written a book about this, Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. There's no doubt, when you look at the full history going back to the start of the 90s, it's complicated. There's no doubt. It is a complicated history there. It's not clear-cut. It's not simple, I don't think. A bit of American meddling in there, a bit of Russian meddling. Everyone's meddling around in Ukraine. I think the theme of your book, though, is that very much that Russia was provoked into waging this war. Why do you say that?
Well, of course, it was. It was American meddling, as you say, going back really to the end of the last Cold War, as I document in the book. And I would object to sort of the way that you paraphrase it earlier in the show, that I think you're implying that I would argue that Kiev brought this on themselves, as the subtitle there says, Washington is the one who brought this on.
I wasn't talking about you directly there, sorry.
Yeah. Right, it's okay. I just want to clarify. And I'm not arguing either that they gave the Russians no choice, because I think they had lots of choices to do this. That still doesn't.
Why didn't Ukraine just ask America to put a military base in its country to help secure it instead of just a promise to defend them from invasion? Because the Americans didn't want to give them enough of a guarantee. They wanted the ability to wiggle out later if they had to, which is exactly what Obama did, if you catch my drift. There's never enough critique directed towards Obama for 2014. There's never enough.
Doesn't absolve the responsibility of the Americans. And basically, to sum it up, it's broken promises on NATO expansion. It's missile defense systems installed in Romania and Poland in violation of the Founding Act of 1997. And it's...
Remember when it was supposed to start with Jake Broe's point earlier, when, you know, it's supposed to be passed over to him. This fellow on the right, I don't know who this guy is actually, but this fellow on the right, you know, he jumped in. Jake Broe's reciprocating. This has the risk of derailing very quickly now. You're going to come for tit for tat. Escalation, if you will.
Essentially, an American-backed side in a long-term civil war that's going on in the country after America overthrew the government twice in 10 years, in the Orange Revolution of 2004 and the Maidan Revolution.
Penny Johnson nodding his head like a fucking reach. I'm sorry, man. Really? Twice? Man, the Ukrainians are just like basically proto-Americans. They're like our hell spawn that we've just birthed from the ground. We can control them like with puppeteer strings. Protest now. Protest now. Ooh, ooga booga. Dude, is this not just silly saying this out loud? The reason why people protested in 2004 is because the election was stolen. Okay? You guys all stormed the Capitol when you thought the election was stolen because a moron lied to you and you were a bunch of even bigger morons. But an election is actually stolen overseas and you can't understand why somebody would protest? Really? You guys like want to release the guys who beat up the cops over your fake steal. A real steal happens. No. That was all American puppeteering. Come on. And the second one, 2014. Okay. Let me throw out some reasons the people had to protest. Number one, Yanukovych pulled out of the association agreement, which would have given Ukrainians free travel, visa-free travel to many places in Europe, something that they wanted. It would have included trade benefits that would have helped Ukrainians, which is why they negotiated it for years. And the reason he pulled out because the Russians added pressure on him, cutting off trade at the border, doing the exact type of economic coercion the Russians promised not to do in the Budapest Memorandum. Number four, the Russians not only were asking them to not join the association agreement and undercut it, but they were then trying to push Yanukovych to join the Eurasian Economic Union instead, which is what many people, we don't know the exact details, but it's what is suspected, is what I think was probably it, and was the pathway they were going down. It was basically, no, you can't economically integrate with the Europeans. You have to economically integrate with us. They were asking for economic domination. Number five, the Yanukovych government pulled out in the middle of the night. They didn't do it when people were listening, when people could respond. After he made this promise when he was running for office in 2012 on the campaign trail, he did it in the middle of the night to suppress protest. Number six, when student protesters still went out to protest, they were brutally beaten with metal poles and later even like flashbangs with nails tied to the side. It got pretty awful. And that brutality caused even bigger protests. Then Yanukovych tried to outlaw protesting, which, guess what? Didn't work. Okay, Mr. Libertarians, okay? That doesn't work. People still like freedom. Big surprise. When you look at it like this, before I even get to the fact that Yanukovych hired gangs to help put down the protests, if Obama or Biden hired MS-13 to try to put down a conservative protest, how would you guys react? No, the West did it. It was the West. It was all organized by the West. Get out of here. The Ukrainians had so many legitimate reasons to protest, and every single time you dismiss these protest movements or the Revolution of Dignity as, oh, it was just like an American coup, you know, or whatever. You're robbing them of their sovereignty, of the struggle that they did. People died. You think people are just going to die for their American masters?
In 2014, because the wrong guy kept winning the election. And as the Americans said over and over again, and I document it as thoroughly.
I'm sorry, this is just like straight up Russian propaganda, just being regurgitated. This isn't documented because it's a lie.
As could be, we are taking Ukraine away from Russia. This is not allowing Ukraine to be independent. This is America forcing the issue, and as everyone on this panel knows.
Putin wrote essays that he doesn't believe Ukraine can exist unless it is an extension of Russia. It seems like they've set the tone.
The status quo in Crimea held from 1991 all the way through 2014.
Well, if you ignore the crises where the Russians tried to build bridges in order to try to challenge the terror, well, if you ignore all that territorial land grabbing that was the attempts that were being made, there's like a whole crisis about it in the early 2000s. But if you ignore all of the history, then yes, if you just ignore the history, that is true. What the fuck, dude? This guy wrote a book. He wrote a book about this. Come on, 1 second. I think Crimea. I think I'll find the crisis. I'll bring a wiki article up on it just so, because if he doesn't know about it and he wrote a book, apparently nobody knows about it except for me, apparently.
Until America overthrew the government there for the second time, and the new government.
America did not overthrow the government. You can look at the crowds.
Oh, shut up, man. You know what? We heard your piece. They immediately.
He interrupted at the start, okay? You little whiny little demon boy. Look at this. 2003, Tuzla Island conflict. A dispute over the Tuzla Island and the Kerch Strait across between Russia and Ukraine in 2003 sparked an unannounced Russian construction of a causeway from their side of the strait towards the island, which is Ukrainian territory. Russians offered various reasons for building the causeway, but Ukraine saw it as a threat to their territorial integrity. The dispute raised fears of an armed confrontation, but a settlement was negotiated. And they just started building it. It was like, you know what? Screw it. And this was under whose administration? Oh, Putin's. Who would have thought? Not only has this happened before, that there was actually confrontations over this, it happened under the current administration. He wrote a book about this. A book, he says, with words and sentences and paragraphs, in fact. Maybe even a chapter or two.
Immediately threatened to kick the Russians out of the Sevastopol naval base. Only then did the Russians change the status quo on the Crimean Peninsula, which, by the way, belonged to Russia since the 1780s.
By the way, I don't know if he knows this because he lied about the history. The Ukrainians did offer to continue to lease out Sevastopol after the Euromaidan revolution. They understood the stakes, they understood the amount of power Russia had, and so they said, let's negotiate. Let's negotiate over the naval base, which, by the way, is on Ukrainian territory. Why is it all of a sudden, when it comes to Americans' military bases around the world, every single one is an atrocity upon sovereignty, even when they're in countries that want them to be there? And if they're in countries that don't want them to be there, fair enough, remove them. But Ukraine doesn't like a naval base in Sevastopol. It says after the Euromaidan revolution, understanding the stakes and that Russia could do something, okay, let's negotiate it, continue, let's figure something out, and then they invade. You can go check the history if you want.
80s, since before the American Constitution.
So did
was
Alaska.
even...
Should we give Alaska back?
Anyway, this guy's an idiot, but if you want me to keep talking with you, Piers, I'll happily
finish your point.
This guy sounds, I'll tell you what, with this guy talking about, oh, we just have to help them win. That's what they said for 20 years in Afghanistan. Oh
my God, it's the same shit. It's the same shit a different day, man. Remember that country where we were there and, it's 20 years of guerrilla war where our soldiers are dying? Yeah, it's like this war where a big country invaded a smaller country that we agreed to support if they were invaded and none of our troops are dying, and we are overwhelmingly liked there. Yes, that it's the same war, no differences whatsoever. Come on, man. I mean, we spent like $2 trillion in Afghanistan. We've sent the Ukrainians, I think, $100 billion in military equipment mostly. No.
Just have to help the Tajiks and the Hazaras and the Uzbeks crush the Pashtuns, and once we're done, it'll be great. We can't sell them out now. We can't leave now. And then what happened? Hundreds of thousands of people killed, and they lost anyway. And everyone knows it's in the Wall Street.
Kind of weird to just say the Taliban is just the Pashtuns. I mean, they're made up of mostly Pashtuns, yes, but I don't know. I feel like another organization could represent the Pashtuns. They'd be like, I don't know, describing all... No, I don't want to get into it. Whatever. We're getting off course.
Journal. It's in the Council on Foreign Relations Journal, Foreign Affairs. Even Richard Haass, the former president of the CFR, has a new piece in Foreign Affairs saying, give it up. We know that there's nothing America can do to help Ukraine retake the Donbass, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Crimea. They can't, unless you want to call in the B-2s and the B-52s and the U.S. Navy, at which point we have a...
So what do we do with Kursk? Do we just give that land up for no reason? Why wouldn't we trade that land for land? The Ukrainians have shown that they can invade into Russia itself. Why not you trade that land for land? You want a deal? There's a deal. Like, there's not even an attempt to get the Ukrainians the best situation they can. It's just completely like, fuck them. It's completely just fuck them. That's the mentality here. It's fuck them, fuck them, fuck them. And he can pretend that it's Washington that did it. He can pretend that it's Moscow that did it. No, it's the people that's undercutting Ukraine support that did it. Of course, it's the Russians who did it first, but those who cut off the water supply to a firefighter by stepping on the hose does lay some blame. They're not the fire, but they're not helping.
General war. So the war is lost. So this guy can bloviate all he wants about how, no, it would be...
The war is lost. They were invaded, and the Russians tried to conquer the whole country. When you say a war is lost, that usually means the Russians achieved all their goals, or the Ukrainians achieved all their goals, so the Russians lost. Like, lost in what way? A certain war goal could not be lost, but if the Ukrainians, even if they just hold what they have now, the Russians want Kherson. The Russians want Zaporizhia. They want to take the cities. When she's, oh, Kherson's lost, Zaporizhia's lost. Let's be clear. The city of Zaporizhia has hundreds of thousands of people in it, still in Ukrainian territory. Do we just sell that out? Do we just say, I'm sorry, everybody, you have to evacuate, give up your homes, give up your land, including people who have evacuated from Crimea, then to Donetsk, then to other places in Donbass, then to Zaporizhia? How many times do these people need to evacuate and give up their homes for you to be like, okay, you've sold out your freedom enough for me to feel safe?
Wrong to turn our back now. The Russians haven't even launched a full-scale mobilization in their country. This is a police.
The Ukrainians haven't launched mobilization of people between the ages of 18 and 23. There's reserves on both sides that neither want to tap into due to the questions of political popularity. They're both constrained.
Action to them.
And of course, demographic future, because both countries have massive demographic problems.
While the Ukrainians are already running out of men, and Jake Sullivan is...
Again, he's pitching this as, here's all the problems with the Ukrainians, here's all of the Russians' advantages, well, including none of the disadvantages. It's a very narrow view of the conflict. Like, yes, the Ukrainians have a manpower problem. They also have manpower reserves they could call upon, but don't want to due to demographic problems. The Russians also have manpower reserves of young people that they don't want to call upon because they had a post-Soviet birth collapse just like the rest of the countries who left the Soviet Union. And so they're both constrained by these things to just lay, oh, the Ukrainians, you know, the Ukrainians have manpower problems, the Russians don't. Yes, they do. They have manpower problems too. And they're spending more and more and more and more and more, a lot higher than the average Russian wage in order to recruit people. So much that the poverty rate in Russia has actually gone down. Not because of great economic growth, but because of death payments to families because their soldiers were killed at the front, and the incredibly high rates they have to pay soldiers in order for them to go fight in Ukraine, which is not sustainable for 3, 4, how many years they would have to keep fighting if they wanted to get all the way up to somewhere like Zaporizhia and take the city, or to take Kiev, or go for any of their major goals that they have not been able to achieve.
Is demanding that they increase conscription. That is slavery. On behalf of a war, we're looking at antiwar.com today.
Come on.
Hey,
can we like get people who are serious to talk about war? Can we, I mean, Piers Morgan, can he not get somebody on the other angle here who's serious? This is not serious. This is not serious commentary. This is a storyteller. This is not a historian. This is not somebody who is giving somebody a complete picture of the war. This is I mean, it feels almost like propaganda, honestly. Like, can we like, I don't, there's like intelligent opponents of aid out there, or not even intelligent opponents. You find intelligent people who are like, we should find a solution as quick as possible, and maybe even make some concessions and letting them hold what they have, maybe. But this guy's saying, like, give up Kherson, give up Zaporizhia. Ukraine still controls the cities of Kherson and Zaporizhia. The Russians are hunting civilians in Kherson right now. I don't like slavery, but giving the Russians a giant city of people who don't want to submit to them, that they've been hunting for the better part of 2 years, you know, that seems reasonable. I mean, it is what it is. Bad peace is better than hot war.
Have the
Russia
headline.
has
The
conscription.
majority of Ukrainians want to negotiate. There's your democracy for you. The majority of Ukrainians know that what I just said is true. Even Yulia Tymoshenko.
People like Chomsky genially just think the invasion is justified and they shouldn't be allowed to join the West, even if they want to.
I don't know I don't remember what Chomsky said because I haven't listened to Chomsky in a while. But the idea is that the West provoked them enough that it's basically kind of our fault. But when people talk about like justification, it's all, a lot of times, a lot of these Marxists, like really hardcore materialists, they just kind of look at it like an interconnected like system of empires, and all it is a big chess game. And they remove all ideology. They remove any of the standards and norms that were placed upon a country's sovereignty. And then a lot of times, even though they're supposed to be the ones that are respecting the locals, they remove the independence of the people there and their decision making. Like, if you were to ask Chomsky about whether the United States should invade Cuba, I think he'd probably say no. If you were to talk about, well, what about the fact that it's so close and it's near America's borders, I'm sure at the end of the day, if the question was, is it justified for the United States to invade Cuba? The answer would be no, and I would agree with that. It would be no. But maybe it's hard to have that reflection for the other side when you've been retroactively, or where you've been reactively trying to respond to like American invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan for so long, and now it's just impossible to be like, well, maybe in this instance, for the Ukrainians and what they want and what would be best for their prosperity, it'd be better if they were not domineered over by their neighbor and they're able to choose their own pathway forward. It's hard to really say. I'm not in their mind. I can only guess.
A year ago said.
Oh, also, the thing about the majority of Ukrainians wanting to negotiate. It is true that the majority of Ukrainians want to negotiate, but this is a really scummy use of statistics considering what he's asking for. Because the majority of Ukrainians want to negotiate, about 52%. So bare majority, but certainly more than a plurality, don't want to negotiate. Then if you break down the number of Ukrainians who want to negotiate, about 56 or 7% say that they'd be willing to give up some territorial concessions. Now, if you break that down, that means about 29% of the Ukrainian population is willing to give up some territory in order to have peace. There is no negotiation with the Russians right now that doesn't have them demanding territory. So to say that 52% want to negotiate and leave out that only 29% are willing to make concessions, and if you break down that 29%, I think the concession they might be able to make is like Crimea. They'd be like, okay, maybe we'll give up Crimea if it's, maybe it's an own thing, maybe, or maybe even if the Russians keep it, but let us get our land back to end the bloodshed. But if you say, okay, let them keep everything they hold on to now and grab Kherson and Zaporizhia, no, you're going to get very few people who are going to say, yes, that's okay. Okay, hold on to everything they have now. I still think it's going to be very few people. Now you're down, way down from the 29%, you're down even lower. And that's going to be like the bare minimum Russian demands in this area. Not trading land for land, which is what probably the majority of them would say, okay, if we trade Kursk for, Zaporizhia and Kherson, maybe we find some agreement about Donetsk and Luhansk because, we've been fighting hard for that, yada, yada, yada. That would be what they would be probably considering. Not this demand of Russia gets everything it holds on to and Zaporizhia and the rest of Kherson. So the way he's citing these statistics, which are from Pew Research Center, by the way, I've looked at them already. I don't think it's particularly honest, but it's probably another statistic he'll use out of context in his book. He has a book, by the way. Did you hear?
It's time to negotiate.
Okay.
This guy's a fool.
Okay, well, before I go to General Kimmitt, again, I want to just get Jake to just respond to that, because you're a fool, apparently.
Well, according to this guy, democratic revolutions are never possible. We had one in this country in 1776.
What are you talking about? I didn't say that. Why don't you argue with something I said, you dumb bastard?
Wow.
Who's this fucking clown schmuck? Who's this clown schmuck? Where does Piers Morgan find these people? Where does he find these people? Yes, you did. You didn't say it's literally not possible, but you completely discredited the Ukrainian bloodshed, the blood that they spilled in order to try to attain what they thought was more democratic, which is not getting hustled by gangs and having protesting outlawed, Mr. Libertarian.
A curd is a curd.
Ay. Thank you for the $5. Help me understand how Americans are so susceptible to the slop. Like, why are there Americans willing to accept literal anti-American propaganda? I mean, to them, it's very easy to be like, our country has problems. Where are those problems? It's because we're giving something to the other guy. If we just stop, all we need is somebody in there to make a decision not to give something to the other guy, then I'll be better off. Then I'll get to keep my taxes. Then I'll get to keep my pay increase. Then stuff like my issues will not be as bad. Even though like foreign aid makes up a very small percentage of the American debt, American deficit. I think it's like literally half a percentage point if we're talking about literal aid, and if we're talking about like military support. Oh.
Fake Alec Kyle Parker has donated $5. Do you think this show would be better if it was Jeremy Clarkson Uncensored?
I doubt it. I highly doubt it. Thank you for the $5. But the idea is like, if we stop giving the stuff to them, then the stuff will be for me. But I'm sorry, you are not going to be able to get your taxes back from a 30, 40, 50-year-old, no, 50, 60-year-old M113 troop carrier.
Wow. Okay. You got some anger
I didn't say it
issues,
was
man.
never possible. America spent $100 million to overthrow the government in Ukraine.
These guys
That's
on this
not a
panel are
democratic
arguing that the
revolution.
people of the
He's literally just making up like nonsense. We didn't give anybody guns. We didn't give anybody shit. We gave money to different NGO cutout organizations that were training civil servants, that were training election monitors. Some of it had to do with like fighting like human trafficking. Others were like tiny like press groups for like local news. And so the idea is we funneled the country full of pro-Western money, made all the Ukrainians super pro-Western or organized the protests, and then we overthrew the government. While completely removing any of the context of what's going on. And the only way they can make this argument is by removing the violence from Euromaidan, is by removing the motivations, removing the historical background. And even though this guy wrote a lot of books, he didn't give any of the background for Euromaidan. It's just simple. We funneled in money. The government collapsed because we funneled in money. And then the Russians invaded because we overthrew it and made them like love the West or whatever. It's just nonsense.
The former
That's
Soviet
Barack
republics
Obama
have
and
no
Joe
right to
Biden overthrowing
self-determination.
the government there.
They're saying that as soon as
Give me a
Putin
break.
installs
Can Piers shut this fucking I'm trying. I'm learning, okay? Can somebody please quiet down this knuckle-dragging window licker so we can listen to Jake talk for a moment?
strong man in any of these countries that remains corrupt and loyal to him, change is never possible. Viktor Yanukovych was not killed. He was not imprisoned. He fled. He fled back to Russia. He fled back to his masters. And in my opinion, when you're the president of a country and you
because
flee
America
the country,
spent $100 million
you gave up your power.
overthrowing him.
How did that money do that? I would like to say, okay, tell me the exact groups we gave the money to and what was the money used for? That would just be the two follow-up questions. Piers, please ask.
Look, man.
Okay, so if I'm being serious here. I genuinely want to understand the conspiracy that the United States is behind the color revolutions of the Soviet
you've never heard of
republics.
the National Endowment for Democracy, huh?
The National Endowment for Democracy is the fund by which that gives them the money to the different groups. He doesn't know anything. How do you write all those? Is all those books his books behind him? He's got Provoked. I imagine Provoked is his book because he's got it framed next to his other copy of Provoked, right next to his right? The National Endowment for Democracy is the endowment fund by which gives money to different democratic initiatives around the world. And a lot of it's like election monitors, civil servants, different like small media organizations for like covering local news and stuff. That's the type of stuff it gives it to. So what he is saying is basically the entirety of the money that we funneled through the National Endowment of Democracy was like a coup, was the coup money. And we threw it in there and then that caused the coup. That's what he's saying. So it's not like the National Endowment for Democracy is our like CIA revolutionary. No, this would be like saying like, I'm trying to think of a comparison, but I honestly, I can't because it's an endowment fund. It's an endowment fund that gives money to these different groups. He didn't say the group that got the money that did the revolution. He just said that an endowment fund exists.
When Russia invaded, why did we offer them a ride? Why the delay in tanks? Why the delay in HIMARS? Why the...
Ah, man, Jake, he should have stayed in that area and say, what about the National Endowment for Democracy? Who did it give it to that did the revolution? You just got to keep following it down until you get to the bottom of their knowledge and then hit that bottom hard. Because once he says, like, what do you mean? They gave it to money that did coups. Because do you think he remembers these groups? Did you think he even looked at the specific organizations? I did. I did a video with Lonerbox responding to Mearsheimer on this exact topic. If you want to actually look at some of the funds and some of the groups that were given the money, you can go check out that video. It's on Lonerbox's channel.
The delay in Patriot systems? Why the delay in F-16s? Why are we just giving approval for ATACMS this week after 1,000 days of the war?
This is the level of commentary that is degrading American support for Ukraine. This is the level of cheap knowledge of bottom barrel history that is informing Americans about the war and turning them against it. This is it right here. It's this type of propaganda, and you can't call it anything else than that. Propaganda. It's not like, hey, let's talk about the corruption scandal around the military jackets in Yarmouk and talk about the improvements that Ukraine cannot make in enough time in order to improve the military situation. No, there isn't like a rational, like, these are the problems that they need to resolve. They can't resolve them for XYZ reason, so this is why the war cannot be won. It's just whatever the fuck this is. It's nonsense. This is what angers me. Because if there was something for me to grab onto and like twist here, you know, be like, okay, let's talk about the military jacket scandal. Let's talk about how corruption works in Ukraine. Let's talk about these topics. Instead, it's just fairy tales. How do I tussle with somebody like, you know, he climbed up the beanstalk and there was a giant at it. There's nothing to debate there because it's not I just say that didn't happen. That's the difficulty Jake Broe's having here, is you've got to get to the bottom of the fact that it's fairy tale nonsense. So you got to get into the specifications of where this money came from. Where did the money go to? Where did the money go? Tell me where the money went. Tell me where the money went. Which organization? The National Endowment for Democracy is an endowment fund. So where did it endow money to that did the revolution? You don't just start a revolution with little pamphlets on the street saying, let's protest corruption. Okay? I think it was the violence that the government responded to, which caused the violence in return from protesters largely defending themselves, which then became the Revolution of Dignity through months and months of protest. Could you imagine? You have gang members sent to put down your protests, cops that are using flashbangs tied with screws and nails thrown into the crowd. You've got them firing rubber bullets and then real bullets at you. And you're out there getting shot at, getting beaten, getting hurt. Over 100 people die. And you're like on the day before and you're like, one more day, guys. We can hold out for Victoria Nuland. Like, no, come on. It's a cartoon. They're treating these people like they're children. Ukrainians are real human beings with real motivations, real hopes, real wishes, real lives.
Why are we just giving approval for ATACMS this week after 1,000 days of the war if the conspiracy always was the United States was trying to separate Ukraine from Russia, that we're trying to install a CIA-backed government or whatever? I don't understand this conspiracy when we haven't done everything to fully support Ukraine.
Okay,
Can you explain this to me? Because I don't understand.
Okay, let me just time out for a second. I want to bring in General Kimmitt. I'll come back to you, Scott.
Well, he asked me something, Piers, so let me answer it.
Please don't. Let's shut him up. Somebody stuck a sock in his mouth. He said nothing of value this entire conversation. Somehow he's more frustrating than Benny because he's just so arrogant about his lack of knowledge.
Okay.
Look, you're completely mixing up what I said about 2014 with then questions about 22. Clearly, as everyone on this panel knows, they announced repeatedly in the New York Times and the Washington Post in March and April of 22 that the purpose of the war now is to prolong it for the strategic weakening of Russia.
There was a few military minds who said that basically continuing to support Ukraine is also of a benefit to the United States because Russia is a strategic enemy of the United States, and therefore bleeding out the Russians is positive for the United States. But that doesn't mean that the strategic end of the war was necessarily to drag it out as long as possible. It was to stop the Russians from advancing. I mean, there's multiple people who have multiple different motivations for supporting Ukraine. To say that the goal was necessarily to just bleed them out and to use the Ukrainians to bleed them out, and that was the entire goal. No, it's reductive. There were some who view it that way as well. If nothing else is achieved, we've bleeded out a strategic enemy. There is some who view it that way. That is true. Some generals.
So no amount of the weapons
Russia
you
can
just
stop
named,
this war at any time. Russia's
no amount of the
themselves by
weapons you just
continuing
named,
this war.
no amount of the weapons you just named would have turned the tide at that point.
Okay, let me bring in.
The Biden administration decided to trickle the weapons in, as you correctly described, in order to keep the war going.
All right, let me bring in General
Russia.
Kimmitt. I want to bring in General Kimmitt now. General Kimmitt,
oh, yeah,
a lot
you
of people
don't
have.
understand.
Hang on, Scott. Let me bring in the
that's
others.
The same reason they backed
there are
the
four
Mujahideen
people on the panel.
Can he just shut up? Oh my God.
Stand in the 80s.
Scott, let me bring in General Kimmitt. If you're waiting very.
And bleed them to bankruptcy.
Scott,
Do you
I will come back to
understand?
you.
Wait, I thought we were the ones going bankrupt.
Rambo 3.
There are four of us on the
Are you
people on the panel.
Union?
All right, guys, please, time out.
Jesus
Time
Christ,
out,
you're
please.
so stupid. Give
General
me a break.
Kimmitt, thank you for your patience.
There's
a lot
no
of
one more
people are very concerned,
anti-communist
General
than you.
Kimmitt, about the possibility of this developing into a nuclear conflict. I've never understood that, because every red line that's been crossed in this war, of which there have been multiple Putin red lines crossed, he's not done anything, despite threatening to use nukes all the time, and his people threatening to use nukes all the time. I don't understand why anyone thinks he would use nuclear weapons, given the establishment of MAD, mutually assured destruction. Why would he press a button that leads to his instant death? Am I misguided? Am I naive? Or is that the military view too?
Well, let me give you the other side of the argument. It doesn't matter what I believe, but the other side of the argument to argue against your point would be that Soviet military tactics and their doctrine always permitted the use of tactical nuclear weapons, artillery-launched nuclear weapons on the battlefield if the country of Russia was invaded. There is a legitimate doctrinal purpose for using...
Yeah, but they invaded Ukraine. And now that Ukraine's invaded Russia, even a small part of it, it still hasn't been used. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible for it to be used, but all of the same disincentives exist as they existed at the start of the war. And in fact, with 2 months to go until Trump's in office, I would say there's probably even more disincentive for this period of time with a lame dunk presidency.
Artillery-launched nuclear weapons once they went into Kursk. I mean, you're talking about a nuclear weapon that really isn't much more than about 5 or 6 155 rounds hitting the ground at the same time. So my view would be, doctrinally, Putin has an argument to make. His country has been invaded. His doctrine says use nukes if we're invaded. Now, whether he will or not, I think, is a different story. As has been mentioned a number of times so far, we've allowed ourselves to be self-deterred throughout this war. You ask, I don't believe that your guest that says we're doing this intentionally to bleed out the Russians by giving dribs and drabs of equipment to the Ukrainians so that we can go on a killing spree for 1,000 days at this point. I would simply say no administration is that smart and no administration is that stupid. I've sat in the National Security Council Situation Room and heard the arguments that are made between the State Department, the Defense Department, and the President and the National Security Advisor, and the notion that they would be sitting there in some Dr. Strangelove-like situation, you know, wringing their hands or wrapping their hands and saying, let's bleed these guys out for a couple of years because that's good for America. I did not see that in my years in the Situation Room, and I'm surprised that anybody would think that.
The problem is, what happens is there'll be like one general or one military expert that'll say something like, you know, no matter what, there's a benefit to sending these to the Russians because they're our enemies, and what hurts them helps us. They'll say something along those lines. And then they'll take 1 or 2 quotes from 1 or 2 military officials, and then they'll spread that out to be the entirety of American foreign policy in relation to the war. Even though there's I think it's 435 Congress people. Did I get it right? I know Jill Stein got the number wrong. Did I get the number wrong? 435, right? I'm trying to remember the exact number of Congress people. Was it 435? Somebody, come on, help me out here. This is supposed to be an interactive experience. Okay, I'll Google it then. Yes, 435. I was right. Just nobody wanted to tell me. Okay, thanks, chat. You all suck. Well, you obviously... You know what? You shouldn't be watching my stream. Go watch some Schoolhouse Rock, okay? Go watch some Schoolhouse Rock, then come back to me. And we got 435 representatives. We've got over 100 senators. We've got people in the National Security Council. We've got the person advising the President of the United States, National Security Advisor. You've got the Defense Secretary. You've got the President of the United States. You've got tons of different lobbyists. And then you've got public interest groups. And on top of that, you have the American public, who they're going to come to their own opinions. And the polling data will have an effect, too. And all these different things are pulling people in their votes and their decisions all in different ways. And to then try to, like, oversimplify it in that manner, I think is... Like, if this was more of a top-down system, I think it'd be easier. And I think since we have a chief executive that largely gets to dictate a lot of the foreign policy, for from administration to administration. You can simplify it for who's at the top of the, let's say, political food chain, making these decisions. But this is dumbed down to a level and to a point that it's misleading.
This government is either that smart or that stupid.
And before we go back to hang on one sec. Hang on.
Can I address that real quick?
Hang on.
Can I please address that?
No, I'm going to come to Benny in a second. I want to ask General Kimmitt if we go to Benny.
Well, but he was remarking on something I said.
But I know, but everyone must.
This guy loves the sound of his own voice, man.
Must get a fair chance to speak. Before I go to Benny, Benny's point is that everything has changed in America. That a lot of Republicans who would have endorsed a lot of those, as he put it, the neocon wars, and I opposed the Iraq war as editor of the Daily Mirror newspaper here very vociferously and helped lead a march for 2 million people through the streets of London. Tony Blair went against the will of the people, as far as I'm concerned. But his point that really Republicans are driving this movement in America, they're just sick and tired of fighting other people's wars, and that actually there is a real shift in will that is becoming much more insular in America. And
we're not fighting the war. We're not. I'm sorry, man. The Ukrainians here would love it if they had U.S. Marines in the trenches with them. They need something like that. That'd be very useful. We're not fighting the war. We're sending aid for someone else to fight the war. Come on, let's not give ourselves too much credit.
I've heard it said that America's fought wars for the last 60, 70 years and barely won anything because, what do you?
We won the Cold War. What does that even mean? We won the extended conflict by which most of those conflicts were made up of. Whatever. I mean, I guess, is winning the Cold War really worth it? I guess is the point. But I mean, this is Piers Morgan. Wouldn't you think so?
Call a win? What do you call victory? And a lot of them have been a massive, gigantic mess, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Iraq.
No, but let's be clear. It is them invading. We didn't, initiate some quagmire.
Whether it's Afghanistan. So I can understand why people like Benny are like, we're done with this. What do you feel, General, before I go to Benny, what do you feel about that from a military point of view?
Well, first of all, we do what our nation tells us, unless it's illegal or moral. But what I would say is let's not forget the second Gulf War, 99 senators on both sides of the aisle out of a Congress of 100 senators voted for the use of force in Iraq. Now, they were clutching pearls and wringing their hands about 2 years later when it didn't turn out the way we thought it was going to. And one can argue about why that happened, whether it's poor intelligence, poor tactics, whatever. But it's not just the Americans, the Republicans that either want to start war or stop war. It's really both sides of the aisle. And I think both sides of the aisle will say, look, America is willing to fight a war that's an existential threat to the United States of America.
Ask Benny Johnson what he thinks about aid to Israel.
Okay. But these optional wars, we shouldn't be rushing to war just because there's somebody pointing a gun at either us or our allies. There ought to be a higher bar. The Brzezinski rules that we used to talk about before we start putting American sons and daughters into combat. And we seem to have lowered that bar ever since 1982 when
we're talking about Ukraine. There's no American soldiers dying in Ukraine. There's zero American soldier deaths. If we are fighting this war directly, then this is the craziest KD ratio I've ever heard of.
Or 1983 when we valiantly parachuted into Grenada to stop that hotspot of red terrorism. But no, I just think that, look, anybody that says America should go to all wars or America should go to no wars is just being foolish. We just have to be more discriminate about the wars that we fight. We need to have a better conversation about going into war before we send the 82nd Airborne in.
Benny, I do think it's a really interesting.
Could not agree more.
Yeah, it's a really interesting debate, and it's interesting to hear the General talk that way because it's not a million miles really from what you were saying.
Yes, thank you, General. That was very sound.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I thought
very reasonable, very reasonable.
And also, Benny, Trump did not go to war.
To be clear, he just said that parachuting into Grenada was good. Under Benny Johnson's previous theories and he didn't even want to say he'd support Poland, and he just talked about parachuting into Grenada, and now you're like, oh no, we agree. I am just like the general. No, shut up. You didn't have the same opinion. You had two different opinions. Don't just pick up the general's opinion once yours falls flat and start trouncing it around like it's your own.
Or didn't start a new war during his tenure as president. I've talked to him about this. He just sees it as bad business. I mean, it's good business for the people that build all the munitions, but it's bad business for America PLC. Wars are incredibly expensive. And as Trump put it, well, what do we get out of all this at the end of the day? And the answer is often a bigger mess than you started. You look at the Iraq War, for example, you know, out of that came ISIS, which caused merry hell around the world for years. So other than that and wrecking Iraq, I'm not quite sure what the purpose of that.
Wait, but Betty didn't even want to fight ISIS.
War was. It was revenge against a country which had nothing to do with 9/11, etc. So I don't want to go over each of the conflicts, but Trump definitely seems to be with you on this, right? And do you think that is becoming almost the mainstream now with Republicans?
The American people are with me, Piers, because the American people are grounded in reality.
Unless you're citing a poll, you're citing like this poll, like by Pew Research, etc. Unless you're going to be dishonest about it, like the other guy was. Cite a poll. Don't be like, I speak for the American people. You're not the American people. You're Benny Johnson, okay? You're Benny Johnson who got money from the Russian government after you were spreading their bullshit propaganda, okay? You are not representative of the American people.
I have an article right here on my phone that I'm reading right now. It is breaking news at time of recording, Piers, that says that Joe Biden has forgiven the loan of up to the tune of $10 billion that was given to Ukrainian armed forces.
Woo.
So this is just money that will be carried on the debts and the backs of our grandchildren's grandchildren forever for a Ukrainian war that...
I like how he keeps pausing because he doesn't know what to say. He's picking up the words as he goes.
Somebody has yet to, quite frankly, explain why we are funding or fighting.
Okay, Budapest Memorandum. They give up their nuclear weapons. We agreed to support them. If they take over Ukraine, then if they go after a country that is either part of NATO or is adjacent to NATO in a way that would drag us in, for example, Moldova, because of its ties to Romania, as an example, and they already have troops illegally there, it would be easier to fight the Russians as the Russians instead of fighting the Russians and the Ukrainians. I think that, you know, we have similar values to what the Ukrainians are trying to aspire to. And while for some people that doesn't matter, I do think that the fact that they want us there and they want to work with us, that does kind of matter. I think there's a lot of I mean, why? Which reason do you want to break down? Which reason do we go into?
And this is something that is catastrophic.
Also, we're not fighting. We're not fighting. We're just setting aid.
Catastrophic to the American mind when they can't afford groceries. When a mother is standing in line wondering how...
Right. Give her an M113 troop carrier. Give her an Abrams. She deserves an Abrams. That mother of three deserves an Abrams. Most of this aid was already constructed. Now you're talking about the artillery shells, the new artillery shells, fair enough. But when you're talking about like the vast majority of the armored equipment we're sending over, or aid sent up to this point, we're talking about old equipment we would have had to destroy anyway. And then we're evaluating it higher than it really is because we're using the original construction price.
How she will feed her children, or how she will fill up her gas tank, or why there are so many massive potholes.
That's a good point. We could not send Ukraine the aid, and she could have the same problems with no difference.
On her road with a house that she has to rent a single room in because she can't, God help her, afford a home. That's utterly out of reach and unfathomable in the current economy. And she's sitting here looking at Joe Biden forgiving the loans of Ukraine to go slaughter the flower of Russia and Ukraine, these young children that are...
Slaughter the flower. Did he come up with that himself? Slaughter the flower.
Fighting.
Like the Russians wouldn't have invaded if it wasn't for American support. The war would still be happening. The Ukrainians would probably just be dying at higher numbers. Honestly. I mean, when you look at the Ukrainian soldiers in an Abrams, they get hit. They have a much higher likelihood of surviving than if they were in some banged up old BMP-1. And to see the removed tops to prove it. I see them opening the hatches after they get hit in the FPV videos enough to clearly understand that. And you can even look at the casualty data.
and dying in these trenches, and she's wondering, what the hell? I can't feed my kids. And Taylor Swift and Lizzo and Oprah and all these billionaires are out telling me this is great.
Who the fuck cares about, why are we talking about Lizzo? It's all just like, it's dialogue tree after dialogue tree, man. Chop them all down.
Great. This is good. No, it's not good. It's how you lose an entire country. And it's a horrible thing to do to the American people. And I'm telling you, Piers, because I have a man on the street show and I go and I talk to both sides. You can go.
Why wouldn't this apply to the invasion of Grenada? Why did he agree with the general's invasion of Grenada? Old woman, desperate, hungry, on the streets, eating dogs and cats with her child. You know, looks on the TV in the store because she's homeless. Wipes the cold fog off of it because it's the middle of winter and they're covered in 10 feet of snow. And on the TV, they see American paratroopers landing in Grenada. And her first thought is, God bless this country. Like, what's the difference? Is it that Grenada was a Reagan war, so it was good? Just like supporting Israel is the conservative thing to do, so that's good. And so Benny Johnson's not going to call for aid to stop to Israel. Like, this would be much less annoying if I didn't know of the inconsistency. It would still be annoying because he sounds like that, but still.
Go to the far left Palestinian protests. You can go to the far right Israel and or all the way to the heart of MAGA, and they'll all say the same thing. And I asked them these questions, Piers, and I'm telling you, this has got to be a 90-10 issue in America.
It's not. He cannot claim.
Any politicians listening?
Look, listen to this other dude. That's not. It's this that you can't. I hate it when they claim. I'm not going to go out there and say all of America supports Ukraine. I'm not, because it's not true. Right now, it's like really 50-50. It used to be like the majority of Americans still support Ukraine. The majority that went to, but if you were to break it down, the last few research data that I saw was like 20% wanted to increase support. That's me. Then you've got like 20 to 25 that want to keep support the same, and then the other half, which is either like ambivalent to it or against aid. And so there's like, it's a roughly like 50-something%. It moves around a little bit, but those are the numbers. And it's somewhat become a little bit partisan, but there's still holdouts within the Republican Party that support aid to Ukraine because, you know, they're old style Republicans. I'm not going to pretend that the popularity situation is something it isn't, so you can expand your bubble. And that's what this is about, right? He has a bubble on his show. If everybody's like, all of this aid to Ukraine is just a big old money laundering scheme, and I don't want to waste this money on the foreigner. And they're all talking about this on the show. By the way, it's all being spent on terrorism and the Moscow Molotov anyway. They're having this conversation on their show. They're talking about this on the show. Okay? Then they have to leave the bubble and go on a program like this. But he has to still make his audience think, no, everybody agrees with us. Everybody agrees with us. We're the American people. You're the American people. Not them. Not Jake Broe. Not these other people. This general who said something that actually is not with what I said. No. We actually agree. He's a bro. He agrees too. Everybody agrees. Everybody agrees with me. Stop. Just stop. Just stop pretending. It's much easier. Just make your point and say it's the right point because it has the best policy recommendations and it's what you believe in. It's what is right. And don't make fake appeals to popularity. It's already appeals to popularity on itself. It's already not the greatest. But when it's not even real, it's just sad.
This is your 90-10 issue. Americans want money spent in America first to improve the lives of Americans.
I got great news. Most of the money is being spent on American manufacturers to make these weapons before they're sent over to Ukraine. So there you go. Happy we could find some middle ground.
Americans first. And we have big hearts, with the biggest hearts in the world to help out those in need.
Mostly due to heart problems, but yeah.
But we are sick and tired of being sold out for endless wars, and you just listed many of them. For my generation, which is millennial, it's Iraq and Afghanistan. And how did we leave Afghanistan? With 13 body bags in an avoidable, chaotic, disastrous, nightmarish, suicidal mission that got us effing nothing, Piers. And we're sick of it.
Jake, your response to that?
America's not fighting this war. There's no American forces on the ground in Ukraine fighting this war for Ukraine. So just keep saying...
Why is he laughing? He's making a point about... If your point is about American body bags coming home, and there's no American body bags coming home outside of the volunteers who believe in the struggle, what are you laughing about? He just laughs at any time the person who disagrees with him talks. It's all performance. Benny Johnson is, and I mean this in the purest sense, more than anybody else online, he is a clown. As in, he is a court jester. He goes around, he dances, he claps, he performs, he goes when other people are talking, right? It'd be one thing if he had a point to say, but he doesn't. He doesn't. If you go back to him, he's going to say the same thing. If he had these visceral reactions and then he had new points to throw out and they just weren't the same regurgitated stuff, it'd be less annoying. Because I would be like, oh, he's reacting that way because he wants to say something, but he can't. No, he's just trying to be like, ha 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 ha. That's all it is. I gotta stop pausing, but man.
This is America's war. America shouldn't be fighting this war
with a
American soldiers are not.
She just shut the fuck up. You just talked.
Children, sir.
Concerning all of the past wars that America has been involved in, we can't overlook the Cold War. Is the world better off today because of the collapse of the Soviet Union? Is the world better off today with the Kremlin and the Russians weakened? The 14 Soviet republics that broke away.
Why is neither of them gonna let him talk? Is this just Piers Morgan has like lost all ability to moderate? He's lost all ability to moderate. He wants the chaos. The chaos is encouraged. He might not say it, but interruptions are encouraged. I feel that if my city got occupied by a foreign power, Benny Johnson would advocate for surrendering my whole state. For all the bravado, MAGA are a bunch of wussies when it comes to defending our allies and ourselves. And there's also just like a lot of like weird self-loathing that I think Trump has kind of normalized. But I don't want to get into that right now.
Some of them have gone through peaceful democratic revolutions.
Is the world better off
Look at the economic miracle of Eastern Europe. And all these countries.
Why he's interrupting to say nothing. He's interrupting to quip. There's nothing of value here. What is that face Benny Johnson is making?
Countries joining the EU, joining NATO. Do any of them want to return back to the Russian sphere of influence? What this war is about is, does Ukraine have the right of self-determination? And other people on this panel are saying no, because the Russians have nukes, because we don't want confrontation with Russia.
Or because somehow we made them decide to protest.
If Russia wants to go into Kiev and install a puppet regime.
Yeah, they were dodging those bullets during Euromaidan, thinking, quick, storm the barricades from McCain and Victoria Nuland. It's just these story tales.
Regime and basically absorb it back into their empire, like they've done with Belarus. They've got troops in Transnistria. They've got troops in Syria. They've got troops in Georgia. The pattern keeps repeating, and Putin's never going to stop. He's dictator for life. He could potentially live another 20 years. These wars are never going to end. When you look at the stuff they're teaching their kids in Russian schools, they're preparing them for war for the next 20 decades. Putin wants his empire back, and I'm going to continue arguing that is not in the best interest of America. A resurgent Soviet Russian empire dominating Central Asia, dominating the Caucasus, dominating Eastern Europe, committing acts of hybrid warfare all the time. The Russians, with impunity, are poisoning people, destroying underwater cables, conducting cyber attacks. When is America going to say is enough is enough? We're not going to let Russia have their empire back. And it's pennies. The billions that we've sent in old equipment, we're spending the money here in the United States. Defense production is ramping up here to rebuild our industrial base, to keep the world safer. Peace through strength. That's the legacy of Ronald Reagan, and I don't know why I have to remind Republicans of what Ronald Reagan achieved, defeating the evil empire.
A lot of dead gays. Sorry, I'm not a big Ronnie Reagan fan. Okay, you can use Ronald Reagan to bash Republicans over stupid foreign policy decisions over the head all you want, but I'm not a Ronnie fan. Sorry about that. But you have fun with that. Benny Johnson. I understand the point. I just never been a fan of the Reagan man.
I don't understand the people on this panel who are saying, let Russia have it. Let Russia obtain this population, these people, their resources, and then go to the next war. Okay. Poland, the Baltics, Finland, Moldova. It's never going to end unless we stop
I
it
agree
today.
with you, but others don't. And Scott Horton's one of them.
Wait a second. Russia blew up the pipeline. Hold on. Do you believe that Russia blew up the Nord Stream pipeline? Like, do you have better sourcing?
He said the cables, moron. He's not even paying attention to recent news. Another cable, another undersea cable got damaged in the Baltics. He's talking about the undersea cables. He's getting it mixed up with the pipeline. He doesn't even know what he's talking about anymore.
The New York Times on this? Do you actually believe that Russia blew up the Nord Stream pipeline? You just said that Russia blew up the pipeline.
I don't care about the pipeline.
But you just said that in your argument. So now you don't care about your own argument a minute ago?
Is Benny Johnson high?
How many people died where the pipeline blew up, dude? I don't care about this pipeline. I don't know why people keep talking about this pipeline.
So you don't care that Ukraine blew up the pipeline?
Well, it's suspected that pro-Ukraine agents blew it up. We don't know. There's actually one version of the story is that people under Zelensky, but not telling Zelensky, went and did it, working with agents. By the way, you can be against it. You can think it's a violation of, like, whatever, German energy sovereignty or whatever you want to say. I'm going to be blunt. Ukraine's in a struggle for survival. I don't really know how much you're going to get me to care about it when I'm, like, seeing, like, civilians getting, like, hurt every day. So, like, relatively speaking, you know, maybe you could just say that this is, like, you could say this is just, like, Ukrainian Greenpeace. I don't know.
No. It's war.
Okay. Okay.
All right.
They're blowing up oil refineries. What's the difference between an oil refinery and a pipeline?
So you're okay with Ukraine blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, even though that went against
We don't have evidence that they did blow up the pipeline, but if they did, it's war. Russia is blowing up all their thermal power plants right now. They're blowing up coffee shops. They're blowing up supermarkets. They're blowing up hospitals, children's hospitals.
What is that fucking stupid look on his face? Like, oh my God. Why are you bringing up dead children? It's a
hospitals are being
children's hospital. Why are you bringing this up?
Blown up.
Why wouldn't it be brought up here? Okay, do we have to talk about war in a completely non-emotional state? It's one thing to be like hysteric and be like, oh, the children, to a point you would like ignore any points. Can we not like humanize like the victims for a moment if we're gonna talk about how much you care about bloodshed, and then immediately when the bloodshed is mentioned, you're like, whoa. I'm telling you, he's just a court jester. He can't be genuine for a moment. It's impossible.
Other Russians. I don't give a damn about the pipeline.
Okay, let me bring in Scott. Scott, final word to you, and I want it to be this question really that you address. What do you want Donald Trump to do once he takes office in January? What do you want him to do about not just this war, but maybe widen it and to say generally as a foreign policy in the next 4 years? Obviously, the Israel-Hamas war is still raging and so on. What doctrine do you want him to have?
Well, I prefer pure Ron Paulian non-interventionism and abandon all these alliances and come home. And people can make all their Hitler analogies all they want, but Hitler's long gone, and so's Joe Stalin.
That's the lesson we should take from World War II. Hitler's gone. Don't worry about it.
Putin is not a romantic. Putin is a bureaucrat. And the fact...
That's what everybody said at the end of World War II. Wow, Hitler's dead. Wow, war is over now. No more war. This is like the libertarian version of the end of history. Man, Francis Fukuyama, you got some competition.
This claim that he wants to rebuild the whole Russian Empire and all that is nonsense. This is a border dispute.
Really? Come on. Now you're just being naive. Now you're just being naive. You're being naive on a level that bordering on okay, well, where are you getting your ideas from, buddy? Where are you getting these things whispered into your ear? They invaded Moldova. They invaded Chechnya twice. They invaded Georgia. They invaded Ukraine. They are trying to manipulate the Moldovan elections by paying people off. The infiltration in Georgia is well known. They were trying to pay people to coup, and they were organizing a coup in Armenia that was busted up like just a few months ago. What do you mean? Oh, they don't want to. Yeah, you know what? Putin's going to nom up a little bit of Ukraine. He's going to go, tasty. That's enough for me. I'm full. And then he's going to sleep through the rest of his administration. He's a polar bear. He's just coming out, get a little food, and then he's going to go back into hibernation. But what comes out? What happens when they stop hibernating? What happens when they're hungry again? What happens when some domestic issue needs to be solved with the invasion of another country to bring away attention? What happens when the values that he threw at the at the start of this invasion out to the public, with his speech, with his essays, which laid down a groundwork not for just the reconquering of Ukraine, but any country with a large Russian-speaking population that was connected to Russia through Soviet ties. You know what that touches? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Kazakhstan, which has been a little unruly when it comes to sending aid to Ukraine as of late. Moldova, there's already Russian troops illegally stationed there. This is naivete, and on such a level that it baffles me. To say so many things about, I write this book, I am an educator, I've published this, I published that, and you just get it wrong again and again and again, this entire debate, and then you end it with, trust me, the Russians will be satisfied with just a little nibble on Ukraine. I'm sure people said that about Chechnya too. I'm sure people said that in 2008 in Georgia as well.
And America forced the issue through our intervention in Ukraine over the last, especially 20 years, as I demonstrate in the book. That doesn't mean.
Hey guys, did you know he has a book? He has a book. He has a book.
That he's coming for Poland and the Baltics and everybody else next. This is just essentially fantasy land. That's not what this war is about.
That's what they say on Kremlin State TV.
There's a long-term civil war going on since 2000 for 8 years. And it took 8 years before he rolled in a full-scale invasion to reverse the civil war that had already been raging since Obama overthrew the government in 2014.
The Russians invaded in 2014 after this rebellion that they get. By the way, where did these rebels get tanks? Do you think tanks just spawned from nowhere? Where did the rebels get all those machine guns? You think they just got them all from police stations? They would have pistols and rifles. They wouldn't have tanks. Where'd they get the uniforms? Where'd they get, like, all their equipment? And even with all that equipment, they still got shellacked by the AUF back in 2014, and they were about to lose the city of Donetsk. They lost Kramatorsk, they lost Avdiivka, they lost all these places that they captured, and they were getting pushed out. They were going to get crushed. Ukraine was going to end the war in the Donbass, and you want to know what the war of Ukraine would have been? The war of Ukraine would have been the Russian conquering of Crimea, Ukraine taking back the Donbass, the violence probably would have stopped, and the rest of it would be a territorial dispute over Crimean territory. And maybe that could have been it. All this violence, all this massive bloodshed could have been avoided. But no. The Russians pressed it, they were angry that their rebels sucked dick, and they moved in troops. That's exactly what they did. They moved in troops, and then the Ukrainian troops were surrounded, and most Ukrainian soldiers died in a single day of the entire war up till today. At least publicly acknowledged. There might be some private data that we don't know of. In the Battle of Ilovaisk. That's the history. People talk about full-scale war, but the Russians have invaded for, I mean, we knew this we've known this for years. He's written a book about this. People have known that there's been publicly documented photo evidence, video evidence, open OSCENT that anybody can go view. This has been available for well before the Russians invaded Ukraine again in 2022. But no, he read a book. He wrote a lot of book, but he didn't read too much for that book. He didn't go and he look at that or look at the full war of it. Just call it a civil war. Just call it a civil war. I mean, at one point is, if there's a small population of people that don't represent the majority, that is constantly propped up by a foreign government that comes in and funnels them the entirety of their resources, led by the way, gangsters and thugs, like Denis Pushilin, like if you look at the leader of the DPR, like, he was involved in that AAA marketing scheme. You look at the head of the Crimean occupation, he's tied to the organized mob. Prigozhin, what do you think him being Putin's cook actually meant? He was a street thug. Hell, even Yanukovych was, like, taking hats off the rack and running as a kid when he was the pro-Russian president. It's a little different than, I would say, being tied to organized mob hits in Crimea. But, come on. Yeah, the rebels didn't win. The Russians invaded back then. Are we going to really ignore that? It's whatever. Civil war. Just call it a civil war. Ignore everything else. Just call it a civil war.
Okay, so it's just silly to say.
At what point, if the Chinese government, let's say the junta in Myanmar was about to collapse, they've lost all their positions, and right now they're not doing too hot. And the Chinese recently actually invited over rebel leaders to like talk about the war, and then told them to like surrender to the junta, and then the leader refused, and so they just arrested the leader and have them in confinement right now. That's what China's doing right now. Let's say that the whole government really started to collapse, and they're about to march on the Tatmadaw last stronghold, and then the Chinese invaded, and then retook a bunch of land for them. Would we just call that a civil war? At what point is it no longer a civil war? Like, the DPR and the LPR have been long absorbed into the Russian armed forces.
Say that this is all about preventing him from taking over the whole world and all these World War II fantasies. This just has nothing to do with that at all. But all other things being equal, what Donald Trump should do on this issue is he should just be honest with Ukraine. They already accept this. The last general in charge got fired, Zaluzny, for saying that, look, we have to negotiate. We're out of men. We're not in any position to make the change here. Now, you could argue that...
Well, no, Zaluzny, I think, requested 650,000 men. And the government was like, we're not mobilizing that many men. And then the rest is history. I mean, we don't know all of the things that went into the firing, but it is true that a manpower dispute was probably part of it, but we don't know how much.
If France and Germany and Poland and the United States sent our NATO forces into Ukraine, we could liberate the Donbass. But that would be at the cost of thermonuclear war. And no, the sovereignty over Dnipropetrovsk over there is not worth it. Nobody in America has ever even heard of these oblasts before. And no, I'm not willing to trade Travis and Williamson County, Texas for Dnipropetrovsk and for Luhansk.
What is he saying? I don't even know what he's trying to say. Okay. I mean, we've heard this before. You know, who wants to trade Berlin for New York? This just, I mean, this old Cold War argument's getting regurgitated, man.
Oblast. I'm just not. And no one in America is. And as I said before, the majority of the people of Ukraine want to negotiate too. Even some of the radical writers have said, you know what?
Somebody said he's trying to cast a spell.
Just let the Donbass go. We hate them anyway. It's not even a real country anyway. So let's just be rid of them and then we'll be happier and we can move west without their burden. Czechoslovakia broke up into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Nobody thought that that was the world's greatest sin. And it's too late.
Now it's just like, this is like open Russian apologia. Like, they hate them anyway. They want to be, this would be a happy divorce.
West without their burden. Czechoslovakia broke up into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Nobody thought that that was the world's greatest sin.
Yeah, because it's two different countries with whatever. But...
And it's
no Hitler comparisons, but anyway, back Czechoslovakia. Okay, can we not do historical comparisons encompassing the World War II period?
Too late now anyway, Piers. If Barack Obama had given Kiev some H-bombs back in 2016, then Russia would have never been able to do this. But there's nothing you could do to reverse it now. So we need to negotiate. And the fact is, they're going to lose those 4 oblasts. Because even if, and I used to think maybe we can negotiate.
To be clear, he is saying to give them Kherson. He is saying they're going to lose the oblast. That's all of the oblast. He's saying to give them Kherson, the city right now where the Russians are conducting the human safari. I could think of nothing more barbaric and inhumane than to request that demand of the Ukrainians, a demand that they will under no circumstances accept, meaning they would be left without aid if that was his demand of them. This is an inhumane demand. They hold Russian territory. You don't even want to trade that for them to keep the land they have, let alone what you should do is trade it to get the land that was taken from them. It's just no consideration for the Ukrainians. He didn't see them as people when they were protesting, and he doesn't see them as people now.
2 out of 4, something like that. But the thing is, Kiev already cut off the fresh water to Crimea, and Russia has to control Zaporozhye and Kherson in order to guarantee those fresh water supplies. They're not going to give up that so-called land bridge. It's already over. The question now is whether they're going to lose Kharkiv and Odessa, or whether we can call it now and quit while they're only so far behind. And I want to address to the general's point real quickly here, and I show this in the book. And I had missed this before the war because I was doing something else and I missed it. But there are so many quotes of the American establishment, and including Admiral Stavridis and others, saying, we don't know how to defeat an insurgency, but we sure know how to back one. And what we're going to do is we want to replicate the Afghanistan war. And they weren't talking about our Afghanistan war. They were talking about the 1980s Operation Cyclone. And they said, what we'll do is, see, they assumed that the Ukrainian military would be broken and that it would be an insurgency from the get-go, and that we would back this insurgency as long as it took to bankrupt the Russians and force them out the hard way, the same way that Osama bin Laden just got Bush and Obama to do to us in Afghanistan over the last generation. And they said, let's do that again. They said it over and over again. Right now, we're on plan B, where the Ukrainian military wasn't broken. They stood. And so America has been able to back them. If they were to finally be broken and Russia were to dominate the place, all other things being equal, or status quo, our government would go back to plan A, backing the militias of Ukraine against the Russian occupation for the long term. And this is just crazy. And as the general said, we actually are backing Ukrainian forces inside Russia. We have crossed the line of their doctrine of nuclear use. Now,
and no nuke was used. And in fact, the Russians downplayed it. And again, this is my problem. And why are we giving him the final word so we can make this... Yeah. The Russians have been invaded. They have not used nukes. They've been invaded, and not only have they not used nukes, they downplayed the incursion the entire time because there's also political constraints on Putin. If Putin said, we're being invaded, Russia's sovereignty is at stake, that would be an admission of weakness. And it kind of looks like he's losing the war. And even if he ends up winning it, people will still remember that feeling of instability. That might hurt him. And so they downplayed it. At least, let me just say, this is my speculation, of course. But what other reason would they have to downplay it if they could use it as an escalation tool? I think there's political constraints. I think Putin's also a political animal. That's how he stayed on top so long. So I think the assumption that they're immediately going to resort to nukes, I think that assumption's been broken. And saying that post-invade, they've been in Kursk for so long, they're trying to push them out with force using North Korean soldiers. They're trying hard. They're losing a lot of men. A lot of men are getting captured. A lot of men are dying. A lot of armor's being lost. Ukrainian soldiers up in Kursk are killers, man. I know a lot of those guys. They're killers. So, I mean, to me, the theory's already broken. To regurgitate it now is, I don't know why even. It's to bring up a theory that's been disproven. It'd be like if Aristotle came back and was like, well, you know, I actually still think people are the things I said about those wacky animal theories are probably still true, even with all this modern. No, man, just keep your mouth shut. Forget you ever said that about birds, okay? Just forget it. Just forget it.
I'm not saying they're going to. I think they're going to hold their horses and negotiate here. I think the White House calculated that, well, now's the time to do this because Putin won't do anything crazy because he's going to wait on Trump. So now we can go ahead and bloody their nose a little bit more. But even the Reuters piece says they're just trying to get one peg ahead for a better position to negotiate.
Okay.
Because they know that the status quo is the absolute best that they could possibly hope for.
Okay. Listen, I just want to say that's one of the best panels I've had in a long time. Right? I learned a lot.
Oh my God, dude, really? Really? You didn't learn anything from this guy? He's talking nonsense. Okay, Piers. You get in front of him, yell a bunch, you learn something.
New stuff. I heard a lot of passionate views, argued extremely articulately. I thank you all. I thought that was really a meaningful discussion about a complex issue. And we'll have to hope and pray this gets resolved soon. But how that gets done is going to be very complicated, I think. But I'll be fascinated to see what happens. Thank you.
Thanks, Piers. Very brave position. That hurt. That hurt. That hurt. That hurt. That hurt. If you want to donate to today's stream to help me cover the cost of embeds, just got back from here, son. We're going to make a documentary about it, documenting the war crimes that we were able to film a lot of testimony of and get some footage. You can donate at DylanBurns.tv. DYLANBURNS.tv. It also helped me cover medical costs for the brain cancer I've just developed.